Hi, it is so wonderful to be here in person. I just want to thank everyone for that. I can't tell you what a joy it is to see people's faces, even if it's only this part. So I want to talk a little bit about toxicity and extremism in online games. I've spent my career really writing about the more positive cognitive, social, intellectual sides of gaming. And oftentimes I get pulled in these conversations where games are sort of seen as sort of the harbinger of social ills. And I'm typically the ruse that has to argue, well, they're a lively medium and there's not just one thing about games. This is our team that worked on the project I'll be talking about today and our funders. But something has really shifted. I study online games in particular, and I don't think it's news to any of us in this room that the US, the culture and climate, both in person but also online right now, is really undergoing some seismic shifts that I think are leaving us all feeling pretty terrified. And in games, there has been environments where many of us don't play because of the levels of toxicity and harassment. But there has been this sort of real uptick in these kinds of behaviors increasingly in the last 5 years. The ADL recent reports show that 98% of players online report having positive experiences. Those kinds of experiences I've really sort of spent my career studying. And yet now you see that 83% report experiencing hate and harassment in online play spaces. So one of the first things our team decided to do was to go out and do a massive lit review. In academic research, if you want to understand a topic, the first thing you do is find out what's been done before. So we found every article that was about, in this case, we wanted to look specifically at extremism in online games. There were 92 articles, although if you'll notice in the breakdown, many of them actually fell into more theoretical or critical historical analyses, not necessarily what I would consider empirical. Now, don't get me wrong, I do mixed methods, which means that I do ethnographic work, qualitative work, and quantitative work. But much of this work was actually sort of coming out of a variety of paradigms that were not necessarily trying to look at, trends, patterns, variance, or means, but instead trying to understand complex situations like Gamergate in 2014. So we did a summary of the literature, and despite the fact that there isn't a whole lot of information of empirical sort of research studies out on it, there is convergence in the literature of a dynamic that seems to be happening in mainstream games, and it goes something like this. First, you have this kind of lack of diversity at the industry level. And that lack of diversity essentially means that you end up privileging white male gamers because it's white males who are typically making many of our biggest titles. From there, this kind of engenders, or I should say, extremism in America, even broader than our national borders, tends to be rooted in anti-Semitism. But in games, it takes a very particular flavor, and it's really misogyny. It's really this fear that feminists or women generally are taking over the universe of meaning and power, and it kind of aligns with this sort of red pill movement, or what's called the manosphere. The online sort of loosely coordinated blogs, sites, etc., conversations, podcasts that sort of decry the fall of white males and the rise of, I guess, these sort of, feminazis, as they used to call them. Of course, much of this, for those of us in games, which is all of us, we all remember Gamergate and the campaign of hate that happened there. I don't think I need to go over that incident, but one thing that's important to know is that Gamergate did not cause Trumpism, but Gamergate essentially wrote the playbook for how to do campaigns of hate and harassment, not just against women, but against anyone. And that playbook is still in play now with the alt-right. So that's one of the important and lasting outcomes of Gamergate itself. The thing that is of most concern, though, is this idea that online games may be normalizing toxic behavior, hate-based extremism, right? I think the biggest fear in the literature right now is that we're creating spaces in which what would 10 years ago be called a hate incident and have you removed from polite society suddenly now are treated as if it's no big deal. And needless to say, this isn't just in our game spaces, is it? It's across America, especially online now. I often have to remind people, have you listened to Fox News? Have you listened to Joe Rogan? Have you gone on Twitter, right? These are the dynamics that you see. Another fear in the literature is that there's this sort of extremism evangelizing. Every once in a while, you'll see an article come out about the possibility that some of these alt-right groups, Proud Boys, etc., may be doing recruitment, socializing at least, into their ranks in online game spaces, which is certainly not an unfounded causal concern, right, given some of the dynamics we've seen over the last decade. But in sum, what this ends up painting is a picture in which you have mainstream games essentially soft-selling white supremacy, right? Women are resources, people of color are not agents, they're not actors, they're instead other resources or enemies, etc. Now, as I said, though there's convergence in the literature, we really have a paucity of data on it so far. And I think a lot of that is simply us trying to catch up with the whirlwind that has been the last 5 years of terror for many of us. So what we really set out to do was to try to take a little bit of a stab at sort of trying to understand these dynamics empirically. So we set out on a study. We're doing a mixed method study that's funded by the Anti-Defamation League and from our Office of Inclusive Excellence that does a combating extremism program on UCI campus, which, by the way, I'm super proud of. UCI was founded after the civil rights movement, so when you go into leadership offices, it turns out they actually are diverse. They're not just trying to be diverse, and it's something that really drew me to our campus. But we set out with their funding to really ask 3 questions. Now, to side point, my background is in education, and I'm really interested in kids. Teenagers have been what I've been studying since I picked up my first methods class. So my target audience is always 13 to 25, which is the definition of adolescence because that's when neural development is actually still happening. Sorry, everyone that's between 21 and 25. I probably just totally insulted you, but here's the good news. When you hit your 50s, you really wish you had that neurological development still happening too. It's not. It's not. But we really set out to look at 3 questions. First, trying to get at, do online games normalize toxicity and extremism? And then the second 2 are really just where my heart's at, right? What are the resilience strategies that youth have right now already in place? What are they doing to try to live in these spaces and live with their own dignity intact? And third, how do perpetrators conceptualize what they're doing? See, I should just come out now and say that I don't believe that any kid is incorrigible. That's just off, that's off the table for me. In fact, I'd go so bold as to say that I don't know that any human being is incorrigible, but that we could debate over beers later. I'm not sure how well that debate would go. I could lose it, but certainly I hope that you might at least indulge me in the idea that, that kids cannot be incorrigible. They're kids, right? I digress. So we did this mixed math study. I just got some of the data as late as like 1 or 2 in the morning this morning. So this is hot off the presses. We are still doing the interviews. What we're doing is we pulled a large sample, 602. We had 133 under 18, 469 between 19 and 25. And then we built this instrument. We've been piloting it for about 1.5 years. We piloted it 3 times. So it's been validated now. So if anyone's interested in redoing this and collaborating, oh, please come see me. You know, it's Chromebox Alpha. I'm not going to waste your time on that. But right now what we're doing is trying to sort of get a beat on what are sort of the normal kinds of things people are experiencing? What are the attitudes and beliefs of young people in this space toward toxicity and extremism? And trying to tick away a little bit at, might online games be causing some of it? Now, as a caveat, you know, when you do survey work, I'm not real big on surveys, but they're a really good place to start oftentimes because they're descriptive. But when you do them, they're only one slice in time. So you can't talk about cause, right? You can't say that A causes B. The most you can really say is that they seem to be related or predicting each other. So I just want to give that caveat now because survey data is, you know, kind of tricky and weird. I don't want to overstate what we've got. In terms of our sample, it's hard to figure out what the population demographics are, but I put over on the left our sample and on the right is the population, but this is of all gamers across all genres, and this is ESA reporting, which, take that for what you will. You'll notice that our sample has far fewer Caucasians and a bit more diversity, And then notice too that we actually have fewer women in our sample than ESA reports are gamers generally. And again, that's across all genres. But at least I wanted to give you an idea of how representative our sample is, because when it comes to survey, representativeness is everything. So there's a little bit of differences here in who we're looking at. We're a bit more diverse, and also, yeah, I'll stop there. All right, so what do we find? So we asked people, players, about, what do they think causes toxic behavior online? And here I've tried to mark them by those that seem like they're being sort of dismissive, sort of too sensitive, like players are too sensitive. It's a strategy and game for winning. It's just simply meaning, right? So you see some of them are actually a bit more innocent, or I guess blaming a bit the person who may be on the receiving end of toxicity and not actually getting to perpetrator behavior. Anonymity, tilt, and prejudice are very high though. So it's clear that players generally, teen players, young adult players, certainly seem to understand some of the dynamics that might go into this, right? When you ask about perceived impacts, what you see is really interesting too. Notice, whereas causes seem a little bit of a mixed bag, what they think actually causes this kind of behavior, when you ask about impacts, it seems like they're actually fairly aware of some of the devastating impacts these kind of campaigns can have on young people and on other players regardless of age. So if you look over here at anxiety, low self-esteem, social isolation, depression, these are all factors that come out of the literature as well. So these are all accurate sort of negative consequences of exposure to toxicity online. Now we're getting into bystander responses versus victim responses. So when we asked individuals, when you see things happening online, what do you do to respond? Again, I've marked them in color. The red ones are the ones that I would consider are the most concerning. This really is sort of amplifying and contributing to toxic behavior, laughing, being toxic in return, simply ignoring it. The yellow ones I consider a bit dicey. I would probably argue with these that they're a bit perpetuating, because while it's a great way to save yourself from exposure, which I think is really important, and perhaps the first goal is to make sure that the people involved feel safe and can get away from it, it also leaves some of the behaviors intact. It really doesn't do anything to the dynamic of what's happening to signal that this is not a space where that's okay, right? The green ones, all right, right? Or they're supposed to be green, they're kind of gray. Calling it out, reporting it. By the way, it turns out that as a victim, we'll go to victims next, victims who report, victims that ask for someone to report actually massively increases reporting. So for those of us that are playing online, if you're being harassed, asking people to report it gets them to report it. It works, but I digress again. All right, so those are bystander responses. Now look at victim responses. They're really similar, right? I think we lost a little bit of variance. I've got the error bars there. These are all ordinals, so what those error bars are the inner quartiles, just to give you an idea of range. But really, you see a lot of similarity in like how victims and bystanders are responding to toxic behavior. We also asked about responses to extremism. Now, in the bigger data set, we asked about multiple forms of group identity-based, hate-based extremism against groups, right? But here we sort of built a composite and asked about responses to extremist statements online generally. And here's what you see. You see a lot of, so the red ones again are the ones that are concerning to me. Ignoring, reporting actually is good. Sorry about that, I missed the color. But you see, again, this sort of mixed bag in which people are responding to extremism. Ignoring happens to be the biggest one. Or the yellow ones, which, again, may protect you, but certainly don't do anything to disrupt this sort of cycle. And the word cycle is chosen specifically. I'll get there in a second. So just looking at how they report, they respond to these kind of situations, what you start to see is something that players seem to understand the causes, or some of the causes, and certainly the dire consequences on mental health that happen when players are being treated with hostility. But I would argue that many of their strategies of response do tend to leave, in my view, much of this sort of dynamic going. If I were sitting on the sideline and watching it play out, I would think, well, this must be a place in which that's acceptable, because no one's done anything about it. When in fact, people could have been doing something about it, which is logging off, right? All right. Well, I also, I've been having a lot of meetings with various people in my Rolodex from the old days. Back in the old days of Obama, when we believed in governance and democracy, you know. So I've been trying to call in shots and trying to, have conversations about what are we going to do about toxicity in these spaces, right? I don't know about you, but I think I've spent the entire Trump era mostly huddled in a corner. I know how to get out the vote. I know how to protest, but I don't know how to use my expertise to address the national problems we have, and that is what is important to me, number one. But when I would approach various game companies about these issues, again and again, the meeting would sound good, but then between, after the meeting in the hallways, over the drink, you'd literally hear people in the C-suite say, well, if it doesn't affect our bottom line, we can't really do anything about it if it doesn't affect our profit. Is Stan still here? Sorry, Stan. But here you go. So as part of this, we're trying to figure out, well, let me see if I can come up with a dollar number that might actually try to show you what kind of money you lose when you don't control your community and build it right. I don't think I've got all of it. I just got a little bit of a dab. So first, we asked them about perceived usefulness of existing tools. What's so sad here is that really, we're doing another piece of this project where we're doing a policy audit across all the various legal documents that games put out, EULAs, codes of conduct. Codes of conduct are really where all the action is in terms of regulating player-to-player behavior. And yet look at how they're perceived, whether or not they're useful. I want you to pause for a minute and think about the last online game you've been playing. Maybe it was this morning, maybe it was a month ago, maybe it was 2 years ago. Did you ever even see a code of conduct? You certainly saw the EULA over and over and over again, but did you even see the code of conduct? Typically, no. You have to almost hunt them down. So codes of conduct, where much of that kind of regulatory language would be about the things game companies will do if you don't behave yourself properly, are actually oftentimes seen as very, very milquetoast to players, and I have to kind of agree. What they do think is more useful is muting, blocking, right, and bans. Again, protects the individual, but doesn't do anything to our game community. And there needs, in my view, to be both. But here's a little bit more. So we also tried to ask them, now, we asked them, how much money do you spend per month on games that don't have, online games that don't have toxic environments? So this is the mean across the entire sample. And then we asked them, how much do you spend per month on average with games that actually are more toxic environments? And there's that number. Now, I just want to add a little caveat here too, because asking people to imagine what they spend or don't spend is kind of difficult, right? So keep that in mind. But look at the ratio difference here. There's a difference of about $9 per month. So what do game companies have to gain from addressing toxicity? Honestly, a lot. So that's 75% gain in revenue if they would clean their shit up, right? I don't know, stand here? Maybe we could mobilize game companies to try. I know it's really difficult. I'm aware of that. But we've got to do better than what we're doing now. So now on to the bigger questions. We wanted to know, do online games normalize toxicity? So our dependent variable, toxicity, is actually a composite variable. We have multiple different ways. I'm trying to think about what does it mean to normalize toxicity, right? So there's various ways that we tried to conceptualize it. Here I'm really looking at one called justification. So this is items like toxicity is a strategy for winning, or toxicity in online games is just players being ironic, or it's really just caused by players joking around. Have a sense of humor, right? So when we looked at that as the DV and looked at dosage of gameplay, right? Because if online games are causing toxicity, then you should be more inclined to agree with these statements. And it turns out that is not the case. So the fears we have that online games are kind of causing at least this small version of normalizing, meaning justifying it, that it's just play, it's okay. It doesn't seem like that's what's going on. But it does seem like gamer identity is a pretty strong relationship between gamer identity and justifications. In fact, you almost see like level by level dosage. The more you see yourself as a gamer, a hardcore gamer, the more likely it is you are to say that this sort of behavior is strategic, funny, whatever. And that's actually not that surprising, right? I mean, unfortunately, I consider myself a gamer. I do not at all embrace any of this stuff, right? And I'm not going to give up that title because I'm not going to give it away to people who want to do this with it, right? But it turns out that there seems to be this discourse, and I think that's what a lot of the literature was sort of really kind of getting toward, was that sort of case studies of how, think about like the book Toxic Masculinity. There's been a lot of really incredible writing and analysis looking at how hardcore game identity seems caught up with these sorts of practices, these sort of antisocial practices. All right, so that's a little bit of the equation. We also looked at another variable for normalizing, and this is minimizing. So here you'd have things like, players who get upset at toxicity are just too sensitive. Experiencing toxicity online has no effect on the players, right? Once you've gotten used to it, it's great. And again, here what you see is that there's no relationship with either amount of gameplay, length of gameplay, dosage, or gamer identity, right? So in effect, gamer identity seems to be caught up with forms of normalizing, but not all forms. In this case, we've only looked at 2 of about 8 different variables we're looking at. But in this case, it's caught up with justifying, but not necessarily with minimizing the impacts, which is really interesting. So it's okay if you do it, but you know how much it hurts people? I'm not sure what to say to that. Finally, we looked at, do online games normalize hate? Ugh. This is the one that's like a dagger to my heart. I'm deathly afraid to see what we would get here. It turns out, so this again is a composite variable asking players about the frequency with which they were perpetrators in hate-based harassment. And it's very, you have to be very careful about when you ask these kinds of questions because people don't like to reveal when they've been utterly antisocial, disgusting pigs online, right? Including myself. We all want to tell each other that we're wonderful. We never get upset and throw controllers and say ugly things to each other. I didn't tweet that to anybody. I deleted it, right? Okay. So you have to be really careful when you look at it. So we put a lot of language around it, like, again, your answers are anonymous, da-da-da-da, and we asked it in multiple ways. The composite variable of perpetrator frequency, there's no relationship with the amount of gameplay whatsoever, and there's no relationship with game identity. So there's kind of a mixed bag here, right? We see that gamer identity is caught up with forms of justifying but not minimizing, but it's not necessarily caught up with sort of, not necessarily caught up with normalizing hate and extremism. But I do want to point out some other dynamic that I think is actually really important for us to embrace, and that is that when you look at the relationship between the number or the frequency with which participants, players are bystanders, victims, and perpetrators, these 3 variables are deeply interrelated. So here we ran a bivariate ordered logistic regression on the DV perpetrator frequency, and we looked at its relationship with bystander frequency and victim frequency, and what you see are these strong correlations, right? I'm pulling a little bit from Eigenrich and Cole's work, and this is actually based on genocide, which I'm sorry, that's super dark. Bet you didn't know I was going to go there on a nice afternoon, right, in New York. But what I really like about this model is that it starts to help us unpack how these dynamics may be taking shape. Is there any other true crime lovers in this room? Oh, come on, girls. Come on, we're all into crime, right? Okay, you know how every true crime story has like a whole 30 seconds on the woman that got totally murdered and 94 seconds on the white dude who did it, and then about 60 seconds at the end about how he was terribly abused and that's why he did the same things that he did to other people? Right, that instinct you have is exactly what this is about. So what you find is that we can talk about the causes of perpetrators, we can talk about the kind of responses that bystanders and victims engage in, but the truth is that these all predict one another. Now, I am not trying to say here that today's victim is somehow to blame for tomorrow's perpetration. I'm trying to go the other direction and say that at some point we're going to have to cope with the reality that the perpetrators of this kind of behavior online have been taught that by being treated that way. So earlier when I talked about how these cycles of behavior keep on going, why it may be a problem if all you do is ignore and withdraw, right? It's because that when that happens and you're the victim or you're the bystander, for that moment you've just inadvertently signaled that in fact this is a space in which that's acceptable. This is a space in which this is just what we do to each other, right? And so they end up creating what they call the cycle of hostile behaviors. And frankly, I think that what we need to do is figure out how to build some off-ramps, right? Now, this can get into some very dicey water that I'm not terribly comfortable with. I mean, I certainly don't want to stand here as a white woman from California and argue that what we really ought to do is pour a bunch of resources on white supremacist youth, right? That's a problem. Or at least it makes me deeply uncomfortable. But I will say this, to go back to the idea that I don't believe that any young person or even any human being is incorrigible. We're going to have to figure out some ways, both in the way that we design our games, the way that we build our communities, not just in these spaces, but maybe even offline in our spaces, in which we can actually create off-ramps from what this cycle is doing to one another, right? Because today's perpetrators were actually the same bystanders and victims from back that we now are currently, that we're worried about, right? What is the solution? I'm not sure. I will say, you know, we've been doing some other work in the lab. You know, my background is cognitive science and teenagers and online conversation. It sounds so rosy until the last couple of years. You know, and if you look at belief change in cognitive science, and if you look at the literature on misinformation, you know, what you see is that let me put it this way. I don't think that more content is the solution. Have any of you tried to share more content with your friends, neighbors, or dare I say family members that may have different political views than you? I mean, how well is that working? It's not working. In fact, in the misinformation literature, Pennycook and others have shown that there's actually a backlash effect, that sharing more information, even fact-based information, ends up hardening their position. My very first study was a master's study where I compared 3 conditions, one of which was online discussion of a controversial issue, compared to like reading more about it, da, da, da. And it turned out, this is like back in 2001 because I'm super old, and it turned out that the talk condition that I had thought would actually improve reasoning, it didn't. It made people dumber, it just made their opinions worse. So what happens is that when people talk about these controversial issues, more information is not doing us any good. It's not about ideational content. It's actually going to have to probably be, in my view, much more about relationships. It's going to have to be based on the idea that we can mend some fences. I mean, I don't know, maybe we need to do like an Adopt a Republican Day, or maybe we need to do, or adopt one in your network, pick one. If everyone here picked one, you might be able to talk some people off the fence of this nonsense about how our election was stolen, which is absolute garbage, right? Or maybe it's the family that you cut off like me during the pandemic because they were so nutty about their beliefs about COVID, or their beliefs about the election, or their beliefs about civil rights, right? But it turns out that those relationships, breaking those relationships, seems to be one fundamental contributor to some of the patterns that we're seeing. And I would even go on the record, I guess I'm going on the record now, by saying I think that our approach to these sort of off-ramps is going to have to be less about content and more about relationships, more about finding ways to treat each other like we're not incorrigible. Not even crazy liberals, like I'm the only one in my family and they think I'm crazy, and that's great. They still love me, sort of, you know. So I will leave off there. I appreciate your time, and hopefully this hasn't been too glim.